Art Studios Paint and Chat. Today, the chat's about L.S. Lowry, the Northern English painter who's famous for his industrial scenes. First, I'm going to show you my paintings, talk about what we're going to do with them, and then we'll have a little chat about Lowry, why I think he painted maybe differently to what a lot of people might first think. So, it's autumn, and I've been working on some autumn scenes. This painting here is finished. It's one of 4. And it started off as a leaf print. I want to do some autumn leaf prints, and this bit down here is where I kind of lost the plot with it and started just randomly attacking it with a leaf in black after the initial prints didn't go very well. And I keep trying to do these leaf prints. They're a disaster all the time. I tried again, but what came out of it was this quite nice painting that I do like. If you want to buy any of my paintings and you're in the UK, the link to my folksy shop is below in the description. Here is another one, and this is, they've got a wash of yellow gloss. The other one had a wash of orange gloss on it, which is just gloss medium mixed with a little bit of orange paint or yellow paint. And in the background, it's sort of black and white and greys to give the sort of tonal range. And this one's got a sun in it, and I want to add some different colours to this and sort of put maybe some browns in there, some umbers. So I've got myself some burnt sienna, and I got myself some burnt umber, and I've also got some ultramarine blue and some primary cyan here. Look, nice fresh tubes. Ooh, so exciting. Because for this one, I have what I think is going to become a bit of a sort of coastal image, and I think here we'll bring these into here a little bit blue. I'll start off with just some ultramarine, and maybe we've got some beachscape here on this budding landscape. Now these landscapes were imagined, and if we get back to Lowry and talk about him, he was a 20th century painter. He was born up in Manchester Way, and in the late 19th century, and trained sort of at evening school and in his spare time to become a painter. But at the end of his life, he was very, very successful. I do a WikiArt deep dive on his work. I'll put the link to those in the description. I go through all his paintings that's on WikiArt and talk a lot more about his life. He's in some ways an underrated painter. Some people call him a naive painter or a Sunday painter. And that's really not true. He's got a very extensive body of work. He trained very hard and was a skilled draftsman, and chose to paint in this way to sort of, most famously, his sort of urban scenes of people in industrial Britain going to and from work or attending events. But a lot of these landscapes were kind of imagined from his observations and pieced together to create, not always, but a lot of the time, a sort of composition that represented the area and represented the time, but wasn't in itself a real thing. Now, this is kind of similar. This is an imagined landscape for me of there's no real people in it. I wanted to have some people-free painting. In fact, generally most of my painting is people-free. Maybe we can psychoanalyze myself one day and figure out why that is. But there's a similarity between these sort of random landscapes and Lowry's work. But he did also do very sort of calm and empty and flat-coloured landscapes. That's another criticism of his work. But he was trying to represent the area he's from, which was a very cloudy and flat, weathered kind of place most of the time. But it is interesting that he never really chose to go out on the sunny days when it was looking a bit more glorious and paint there and then. He did do portraits as well, which some people might call maybe a little bit cartoonish. And later in life, there was some interesting, later in his life, or after his life, I should probably say, there were some interesting drawings called the marionette drawings, which revealed a totally different side to Lowry. And if you want to check those out and do an extra bit of homework, then I suggest you give them a Google. This one has got a sort of disappeared tree in it, like a ghost tree. I don't really know what it's about. I'm not sure I'm going to work on that right now because I don't know what colours I want to bring into it. I think we'll bring some browns in as well along this bit and maybe along this bit here. And I don't often work in browns, so this is good for me to expand my range a bit. And I'm at the beginning of my painting journey, and Lowry spent many a year chipping away at his art before he found some success initially in some galleries in Paris. People up in the north of England weren't really wanting to hang pictures of themselves going to work on the walls, but maybe in Paris it seemed a little bit more exotic. Right, let's start. Because I know what I want to do, let's start with this one, the seascape, and let's get some ultramarine and just go in here and basically block in the areas that I want to be sea. And for a simple-minded person like myself, we're just going to do that in blue because the sea is blue, as we all know, which obviously is not the case, really, is it? It's a much more complicated picture. Right, so Lowry, what do we say about him? Everyone says he's a social painter. He's looking at the people, and that's very true. He's got lots of people in his work, they're all doing different things, going about the business, they're watching others. There's paintings about arrests, there's paintings about foundation stone laying in communities and coming out of school and going to work and going to football matches and attending fairs and things like that. But what we can also say about him, and what interests me is more, he had an incredible use in a lot of these paintings of perspective and layering, and this has got a sort of layered perspective to it as well. Because he had buildings and he could take advantage of the sort of architectural technique of two-point perspective. Obviously used a lot in painting as well, but probably most easily visualised if you're not familiar with it in forms of architecture. And now you have two vanishing points on the horizon, and if you're either side of a building, it sort of goes off to infinity on either side of there, and everything gets smaller and moves away on these sort of diamond-like tapers. And he was kind of a master of doing that. A lot of his paintings relied on it, and there'd be hairpin turns, and he'd sit on a corner or imagine himself sat on a corner and do the paint from there. Also, his point of sitting, or the point of the viewer, was very interesting as well, because depending on where the horizon is, you can sit yourself way above it or below it, or kind of on the horizon if that's where your eye line is, But the feeling you often have in a lot of his paintings is that you're well above or well separated, or almost in some cases like on a stage. And I think these aspects of his painting are often ignored, sort of how skillfully they were done. And that's what interests me a lot. He had a muted and restricted colour palette, but he did hit it with little bits of reds and blacks, and then some sort of the more dark Prussian blues and things like that. He said he was a simple painter and he'd use simple materials, and it's a very sort of Northern English kind of thing to say, isn't it? And yes, he had what people called a flat style, but that came more from the colour than it did from maybe the perspective in his paintings. And it's interesting that if you look, you do get that depth, but somehow the colour combats or interacts with it and makes it sort of look flat at the same time. So it's kind of interesting to me. Now, one thing I have realised as winter has come is I can't see much without my reading glasses on, so I better go and get them. That instantly makes my painting a lot easier. Of course, the annoying thing about them is you can't see a damn thing anywhere else. So this is just going to have a few inlets of water coming in from the side of it, is the idea. And it came from just observing the piece I've painted, and also like having painted other pieces and having had experience in doing this kind of thing before, and having an idea of where water might come in. I think it'd probably come in just a tiny smidge more up to here, like that. Now, where else would this water be? Maybe down at the bottom here. Lowry did paint water, but his sort of lake scenes were his lakes were often kind of just very pool-like, puddle-like, round pools and puddles. Very simply done. He did travel all over the UK, painting getting inspiration for his paintings, at least. I don't know how much sort of plein air he was doing, where he was sort of out painting live. I think he did have to maybe do that on occasion, but most of the time he was in his house just sort of painting away. I can recommend the documentary with Sir Ian McKellen, also known as Gandalf, Looking for Lowry. I'll put a link to that, and it really does give you a good overall view of Lowry and his life. And there are a few clips out there with him being interviewed and things like that, maybe later in life from the 70s. And they're very interesting to watch too, just to get a feel for the person. And it's amazing how now I think it feels like we're looking into a different time, different era, but because film was around, we've got these things on film, and it's very nice to be able to go back and connect with these what are now historical artists. I'm using a brush, very rare for me. These were created with blades, which if you've watched before, if you're one of the 4 or 5 people that do, you may have seen me use. And today I'm just going to go over with a brush for these bits, just to lay in where I want the water to sit in this case. Now I am going to make a video about the process of this from start to finish. That's going to come out later because I want them all to be finished so that I can tie it all in to one nice video. Something a bit more, a bit different, as I try and expand my range with video making. Now Lowry was unmarried throughout his life and said he sort of had a brief moment with a girl, maybe at art college, but then she left, and then that was it for him. And he was super interested in painting, you know, like a major topic of interest. And I think that filled most of his mind. And he never married, but he did enjoy going to the ballet, and he used to take family friends, but often girls. And interestingly, a girl of the same surname, I forget her first name, but her surname was Lowry. Her mother asked her to write to Lowry to say that she enjoyed art too, so she did. And strangely, Lowry turned up a couple of weeks later at her door and introduced himself, and they formed a bit of a grandfather-granddaughter type relationship, which these days may make you ask some questions. It's not the kind of thing we were doing, but it was a different time back then, a different era, and the lady herself certainly has never made sort of any weird accusations about him or anything like that. And in fact, when he died, because he didn't really have anybody else, he left his entire estate to her, and she spends her life now sort of being in charge of that, which I think she, from what I could gather on this documentary, I think she's happy enough about it, but maybe feels like it was bestowed upon her in a way that she didn't really expect. Maybe like I was thinking about if you win the lottery, it's a bit like a cheat code, isn't it? You sort of break life in a way, and the sort of day-to-day thing where you think, right, I'll do this, I'll do my job, I'll work hard, I'll save some money, I'll retire, I have a family, and it all sort of goes to a vague plan that you have put together. Or maybe, maybe you plan to run a successful business and you end up making millions of pounds or whatever, but you've gone to a plan. But sometimes weird things just happen, and maybe being a teenage girl writing a letter to somebody, like you might have done in those days when I was a kid, I'd write letters to, well, maybe not letters, but you'd send in pictures and things to TV shows and stuff like that. It's the kind of thing that you'd do. And for that to end up with her being in control of his entire estate upon his death must be a bit of a shock. Right, so we've got that painted in like that. The question is, would this bit be water? I'm not sure it would. I think I might leave it like that, just that little hint of water there, and then we'll have this sort of middle landscape here, and then the further out there and there. I've still got loads of blue left though, which is a bit annoying. I should have thought a bit more sensibly about that, about how much I actually needed, bearing in mind these paints are not cheap. So let's put another couple of layers on, shall we? Really block it in. There we go. So I think for now I'm going to leave that like that, and then have a little bit more of a think about it. I will, still got loads of this blue left, so let's have a look. Given these are imagined paintings, can we add the blue somewhere else? And rather than letting it dry and going to waste, of course when we do any kind of thing we make an impact on our environment around us, and just leaving paints to go to waste does like upset me a bit. Let's go in here and do a similar kind of thing. So one other thing that we can maybe mention about being important in Lowry's life is his parents, and he's noted for having one of these overbearing mothers who she was a little upset with her lot in life and wanted to be a concert pianist but never quite managed it, although she was a skilled piano player, the story goes, and she was always a little upset about her life, felt like she'd not got what she deserved, and she always wanted a girl, which she apparently had mentioned to Lowry, and thought he was just a clumsy young boy with no great academic ability and everything like that. Yet she always had a large role in his life, and when she died he did the painting The Bed, showing the empty bed of where she was, with an interesting one-point perspective again in there, much like Van Gogh's bedroom painting, but twisted on a bit of an angle, going over towards the door where we can almost imagine her leaving upon her death. Certainly after that he was very depressed and even thought about taking his own life. So despite her having been apparently controlling and what many think restrictive, he was very upset by her loss. The father was a much quieter man, kind of just went about his business day to day, getting his job done in property services of some kind. And Lowry himself was a rent sort of debt collector, and I think that's probably where he got a lot of his inspiration and stories from, as he was going around asking for the rent. He wasn't a mean rent debt collector. Apparently he was as generous as one could be in these things. And is definitely seen maybe as a gentle giant. He turned down a knighthood and many other honours throughout his career, but he did occasionally like to, hang out with some of the more maybe, I don't know, cerebral members of things like the BBC, like Sir David Attenborough, and things like that. So he, even though he was relatively reclusive, he did occasionally go and meet up with some of the who's who of Great Britain at the time. I'm just putting this blue in here, making this sort of scene. Now the question is, how far do I go in with this? I might go all the way over with this and then cut in across this front bit there. I think that could be quite interesting, and it's going to use this paint up. Drag it all the way out. Try and use some strokes. Even if this is all going to be covered over, it's nice to be able to practice the movement of the brush. And if you were ever going to leave in pastel marks or strokes, you don't want it to be too, you want them to look each one's place, like Van Gogh himself. And even Lowry's work was more impasto than we may realise. There was a lot of more texture in it, and I think because a lot of the time it was, people had prints of his work and things like that, we don't necessarily think of it like that, but it was quite, the paint was laid on quite thick, I think, in a lot of cases. He used oil paint, of course. Some of these paintings would take him up to a year to do, because when you're putting all these tiny characters in and you have to let the oil paint dry, you're going to be waiting around a lot. One of the reasons I don't oil paint loads, I just haven't got the space to. I want to paint a lot, So I want to do a lot of paintings, but I haven't got the space to be hanging them all to dry really, or, you know. At the moment, Dead Art Studios is my house. Maybe one day I'll have a proper studio, but right now I've got to work with what I've got. This blue in nicely, and it might be nice to just do some of the browns on the other one just to finish this painting chat. Then I'll work some more on these since I've got everything out. See if we can get them finished next week. And I'll put them on my shop for sale. I think they'll be £30 with a frame each. Definitely won't be making my time back at minimum wage on that, but that's how it works at this point, at least. So a lot of art critics struggle with Lowry, maybe because if we think about it, he was around at the time of Picasso, Pollock, Rothko, things like that. So the New York scene and also the Paris scene, Matisse leading into Picasso and onwards, post sort of Cézanne and things like that. So he was there in the early 20th century as well, but he's up in Manchester. It's not really hanging out in the main artistic places. So one reason he may struggle with the critics is because he doesn't easily fit into the story of art history, but also maybe a bit of snobbery about his subject matter and his sometimes very loose style. Although Picasso had some very loose style as well, didn't he? So we can't really say much about it in that sense. There we go, that's the blue done. Just gone a little bit wayward there, but you know, we're going to put a colour in the background there and we can go over that. I'll give my brush a little rinse. So brown, the colour I fear the most. Don't know why. It's a lovely colour. There's so much subtlety and variation to it in so many parts of the life, isn't it? In all aspects. Right, so we'll put some in here. Does this want to be dark? Let's go on with a little smidge of burnt sienna and see what that looks like. I can always go over it with the darker burnt umber if I want. Let's not put too much paint out this time. It's still a significant amount. It's harder to put less. I could just like go into the cap, but I feel that that's like poor form in some ways. Right, let's have a look. Use this brush again. And I think even though we've got the ghost tree here, I think we'll just go straight over with it. The ghost tree could maybe be consigned to history and it'll still stay up here in some way, I think. And for me, painting with a brush when I normally paint with other things like blades and things like that, feels very controlled, quite soothing actually. But a lot of the time when I try to paint with a brush, it's because I want to do something with detail and then I get stressed because it doesn't quite go how I want. I am practicing my drawing and making a little bit of process for that, especially digitally as well, which you think might not help, but actually I think it does. And I think that's just giving me a little bit more of a relaxed approach to my paintings as I feel a little more like I know what I was doing. When I made these, started these and I was doing leaf printing, it was all very chaotic and there's stuff everywhere and paint everywhere and I was trying to rush and it just wasn't working. But now it feels more relaxed and like the paintings are what they're supposed to be now, and this is what they're going to be. I can see a way to get them finished. Just drag that straight through. There we go. What do we think to that? Is that, I do wonder if maybe the darker one might help, but maybe we could come through the darker one. Let's get the edge where we think the edge is. Maybe we can come through with a darker one, put a different element within it. And I do think I'll probably be finishing off with some kind of detail, because I'm removing, in some sense, some crude elements of the painting, but then I'm just making it, by blocking it in, it's just becoming nothing again, isn't it? So I need to add interesting detail back in when I've got the colours. I could have done glazed washes, I suppose, and then it would have left some of that from the translucency, some of the information from the layers below would have worked their way through to the front. Whereas this is kind of really is just blocking it out, isn't it? Nonetheless, that's what we're doing. So we'll go with it. This is the crazy thing about painting, it's just so infinite in, or every time you make a decision, it heads off in a totally different direction, very consuming in that sense. Because you're like, oh, I should come back and try and do that. Obviously, you can't do it again to the same painting, really, can you? You never. Especially when you're doing a lot of intuitive painting like I do, where you're just sort of at it, rather than sketching it out and going layer by layer, which is a perfectly valid and more tried and tested method of painting, I think. Unfortunately, not the way my brain works at all. Okay, so we did get the perfect amount of paint there, maybe just a little bit more needed to finish it. So, L.S. Lowry, a different perspective, I think, for me, for many, about social situations and people. But for me, when I look at his works, I think about the muted colour palette and then how that plays against his very prominent and often used 2-point and 1-point perspectives in his drawings and paintings, which I think is so important to his work overall, but is often kind of ignored and left out. Check out my WikiArt deep dive on his first half of his career, paintings, maybe 1 to 60 something on there, I believe, and I'll do the second part to that. Not all of his paintings are on WikiArt, but if you want to look through his work, it's a very good place to go and look, and also obviously the documentaries and all the other videos about his life. Dead Art Studios. See you next time.